Good afternoon, everyone. This is Wednesday, March 10th meeting of the Solar Task Force. I'd like to call this meeting to order and take the roll. So good afternoon. My name is Michael Kane, the chair of the Solar Task Force, and Jeff Shaw.
Present.
Brian Thomas is not here. Please note that he's not present. Mr. Mike Thompson.
Here.
And Bonnie Kellenberger.
Present.
Okay, and we have Les Knapp, so we have a quorum today. And Les Knapp is joining us via WebEx. And before we begin today, I think we have a chance to finish up our some of the main work that we've been, I think, have been working through and toward, and hopefully Les can assist us getting through this today, as well as some of the assistance of Harry Knight. And before we begin, I guess, we should approve the minutes and before we move to any new business. So has everyone had a chance to review the minutes? Okay. Any changes?
Just a one.
A misspelling?
Just a misspelling.
Okay.
The word percent in the exception number 2 on the second page, and Sandy's got that noted.
Thank you very much. And therefore, without objection, I propose that we accept these minutes with the proposed change.
Motion to accept the minutes with the proposed
All in
change.
favor?
Aye.
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 Okay. The minutes are accepted. And so, new business. Harry, you have some new. Do you have some new business for us?
Well, I can let you know that the temporary moratorium on utility scale solar was approved by the county commissioners yesterday.
Okay. Thank you very much for that update. We also, I noticed we received these nice recognition, appreciation.
Oh, yes, if that was a thing on the agenda, right. So that's the annual certificate of recognition from the county commissioners. All the Solar Task Force members received one.
All right. Well, thank you. It's our pleasure to serve and to work on this. All right. With that, I think we have a presentation by Les to give us some updates on what's happening in Annapolis that may both be relevant to renewable energy and development, as well as perhaps to the task force. So with that, Les, I'll turn it over to you to give us an update. Can't hear you, Les.
Yeah, Les, you're muted.
Les, cannot hear you.
I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Now we can hear you.
Now you can hear me. Okay. So I'm going to give you a brief update on what's happening in the 2021 Maryland General Assembly session. There's a number of pieces of legislation dealing directly with solar energy and climate change. I'm limiting my review to those bills that would directly affect local government and might weigh in on your deliberations here. Also, I will provide a brief update on the rulemaking efforts of the Public Service Commission. So I believe I've submitted a PowerPoint, if that could be brought up now.
Okay. Okay.
We can see it. Les, go ahead.
Okay?
Yep, please, proceed.
So, quick overview of the 2021 session. Right now, the session started January 13th. We're just over the halfway point of the 90 days, and things are really starting to pick up and move forward. Critical dates are March 16th. That's the committee reporting courtesy date. That's the date that the committees in the House and the Senate should report their bills out for consideration on the floor. March 22nd is the opposite chamber bill crossover date. That's the date where bills that are in the Senate should cross over to the House, and any bills in the House that want to move should cross over to the Senate. And then we're kind of in a sprint after that to the adjournment on April 12th. This year, the House has considered 1377 bills and 6 joint resolutions. The Senate's considered 963 bills and 7 joint resolutions. That's maybe very slightly on the high side, but not overly so. It's within general averages. Obviously, the COVID situation has made things a little more challenging with virtual bill hearings and other protections that are in place, obviously, to address the pandemic. So moving to the next slide, I'll start going through specific pieces of legislation. First up is House Bill 33, Senate Bill 76. This is the Climate Crisis and Education Act. And basically, this would change the statewide target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It would increase it to 60% of 2006 levels by 2030, achieving net zero emissions by 2045, and then afterwards actually be net negative. It does establish a climate crisis initiative within the Maryland Department of the Environment that would work to address and implement various climate change programs and reduction efforts. And to help fund that, it would establish several new fees on fossil fuels and also certain new vehicle sales and registration. The fees would be deposited into 3 separate funds, one of which is the Kerwin Commission funds to pay for K-12 public education. The second would go to a household and employer benefit fund to establish private efforts on climate change reduction. And the third would be a climate crisis infrastructure fund, which would address public infrastructure needs. The Maryland Association of Counties, I'll provide you their position where they've taken it on bills. Here they took a no position, and these bills have been heard in their respective committees on February 18th and February 2nd, so they may or may not move. There is another similar bill moving that I'll talk about in a moment, so not sure these will actually go forward. Next slide, please. House Bill 103, Senate Bill 90. This makes numerous changes to the CPCN application process. Critically for local governments, it would prohibit a local government from unreasonably withholding, placing conditions on, or delaying the issuance of a site plan approval or any other permit or approval for an electric generating station or qualified generator lead line that has received a CPCN. It also prohibits a local government from implementing a site plan approval or any other permit or approval requirement that is inconsistent with or more stringent than the licensing requirements of the CPCN that was issued. MACO obviously opposed this, given the significant impact this would have on local government land use authority. Thankfully, both of these bills have been withdrawn by their sponsors, and so are off the table through this session. Next slide, please. So the task force looked at and considered language regarding building code alterations to require new construction or renovations to be solar ready. There are some challenges with this, but there are a couple of bills in the General Assembly that would mandate it. House Bill 469, Senate Bill 330 is the first of these, and it basically requires any new construction and certain major renovations of public buildings that have a roof expanse of at least 4,000 square feet and are funded by state funds to be designed and constructed to include the maximum number of solar panels the roof can accommodate. Mako opposed this bill, and each of the bills have had their hearings in their respective committees, but to date, there's not been any movement forward on these bills. However, we've still got 6 days to the committee reporting date, so there's plenty of time for something to pop out. Next bill, please. So House Bill 569, Senate Bill 407 deals with net metering, and this would simply double the statewide limit, currently 1,500 megawatts to 3,000 megawatts. Mako supported the bill. The House bill has passed the House clean and is before the Senate Finance Committee for a hearing to be set. Senate Bill 414 is on second reader in the Senate, so it is passed in the Senate. There are some technical amendments to that. I would imagine they would be appended to the House bill when the Senate Finance Committee takes that up. So this bill looks like it's on its way to passing. Next bill, please. Okay, House Bill 583, Senate Bill 414. This is the Climate Solution Act Now Act of 2021. This does a lot of things from, I think, the task force perspective. There's 4 key issues here. One, it increases the greenhouse gas emission reductions goal to 60% by 2030, and then mandates net zero emissions by 2040. It would exempt certain community solar projects, those that are installed on rooftops, parking lots, roadways, or brownfield sites, and that serve at least more than half of their kilowatt-hour output goes to low or moderate income customers from local government personal property taxes. It requires large commercial and residential buildings that have a floor area of at least 25,000 square feet to be constructed so at least 40% of the roof area can support solar. That means, obviously, the weight of bearing is there, as well as the roof being clear and unobstructed in those areas. Finally, it requires that any public schools that are constructed after July 1st, 2022 to be solar ready or to meet net zero energy requirements. The bill does establish a net zero school loan fund to help meet the net zero requirements if you want to go in that direction. Mako did support this bill with some amendments. 1, to remove the local personal property tax exemption mandate, and 2, to modify the school cost share to better match how schools are currently funded. The House bill is still in the committee. It had a hearing on February 11th. However, the Senate bill has passed second reader in the Senate with some amendments. So that Senate version is moving. Okay, next is House Bill 584, Senate Bill 508, another net metering bill. This specifically increases the capacity limit for eligible customer generators from the current 2 megawatts to 5 megawatts. And it also prohibits the PSC from denying multiple net metered solar facilities that are on separate contiguous lots owned by local governments solely because they exceed the 5 megawatt generating capacity. This will allow for some county or municipal projects that are kind of aggregate projects on separate lots that are connected to go forward in a larger size than they currently could do so. Mako has supported this legislation, and both of the bills have had their bill hearings on their respective committees. Next. Okay, House Bill 777, Senate Bill 417. This affects the power plant research program and how applications for CPCNs are handled. This is more at the state level, but it would say for a project where a CPCN application has been filed, it puts some time limits of 60 days on both the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of the Environment to complete certain studies and investigations, and then have to present their findings at a public hearing held by the Public Service Commission. They then have 15 days after that hearing has elapsed to jointly present the final recommendations on the project to the PSC chair. So this is tidying up the timeline giving a little shorter and more defined period for the state agencies to get involved. MACO took a no position on this because there really isn't a direct local government impact. The House has passed House Bill 777 with amendment, and the Senate heard their version of the bill but hasn't taken any action on it yet. Next, please. Okay, now I'm going to turn, that was it on legislation. I'm going to briefly walk through where we're at with the PSC rulemaking. As you know, the PSC has initiated a rulemaking to change how CPCN regulations and the application process work. This is based on a recommendation from the Governor's Task Force on Renewable Development and Siting, as well as some pressure from the Maryland General Assembly and some interest from legislators to work on condensing or making the process more efficient. The rulemaking was based in part, but not in totality, over some concerns raised about project delays at the local government level, about projects having to go through the local government zoning process. PSC reviewed the regulations and put forth the following proposals. It would basically require a utility-scale solar development either to obtain local zoning approval for a proposed project, so essentially going through whatever process a county or municipality has in place currently, or at least 90 days prior to them filing a CPCN application, they have to hold a meeting with the affected local government and provide a draft environmental review document, a properly sized conceptual plan, and information on the CPCN process. If a developer does that and provides that information to the local government has 90 days to review that information and then submit a preliminary report to the PSC that includes a statement on whether they think the project is consistent with their local zoning, is consistent with their comprehensive plan, and provide any suggestions for improving the application prior to the filing for a CPCN. So this is all pre-CPCN. If a local government does not respond within the 90 days, the developer must provide documentation showing their efforts to contact their local government and the developer's information on the project's consistency with local zoning. After the 90-day pre-application period, the developer either formally files a CPCN application with the PSC or can delegate their authority to a public utility law judge. And once the CPCN is filed, it also says the Power Plant Research Program has 45 days to issue a determination on whether the application is complete or not. That would tighten that time frame up considerably. Now, this does not in any way change or limit what a local government can do in terms of participating as a party in interest or offering other testimony during the CPCN process, but it does obviously significantly change whether or not a developer has to go through the local zoning process. Next slide, please. So the PSC accepted comments through a deadline of February 5th. MACO did submit comments. They made three main recommendations. One was to require early and consistent communication between developers and local jurisdictions. Two was to include evidence of participation in the local zoning and permitting process as part of the completeness checklist. And three, to say that an affected local government should automatically be made an intervening party upon request. So the PSC has these and numerous other comments that were submitted. They are reviewing those, and the next step will be a date set for a legislative style hearing on the proposed homeowner revisions. So next slide, please. So that was a dense information dump on what's happening right now during the session. Happy to go back if you have any questions or want more details on any particular bill.
So I wanted to just ask if there, from what I understood you to say, Les, that although these are obviously will have implications for the development of solar in St. Mary's County, most of what was discussed really doesn't impact the work that the Solar Task Force has already done in the sense of the task force recommendations, at least to this point, not anticipating what will be said today, are consistent largely with these changes that are going on, with perhaps the possible exception of, of course, we're making these recommendations so local governments can, St. Mary's County government can have a say on both on utility scale solar and other projects. So is that a fair characterization of some of the findings?
I think that's a fair assessment, Mr. Chairman. The only area that I would immediately say could be affected by, and more by the PSC rulemaking, would be how you treat applications for utility scale solar projects. If you want them to go through special exception or something of that nature, you can still recommend that, and assuming these recommendations don't get changed significantly from what the PSC initially proposed, a developer could still go through that, but the developer can also say, that's too complicated, I don't want to go through that process. So as long as they meet the pre-CPC and application meeting requirements with the local government, they can take that route instead.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that response. Any questions from task force members for Les?
I had two, and
Jeff?
roll them up into one. Les, and you may not know this or have it before you, but House Bill 33 and House Bill 583, do you happen to remember or know the fiscal notes or the fiscal impacts that were associated with those bills? If not, I can look them up this evening
House
sometime.
Bill 583, I do have that one. That's the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2021.
Okay.
And the general estimate is for the state level, the finances there can't be a reliable estimate made. State expenditures of all fund types will increase significantly beginning in FY 2022. The bill does redirect funding from several existing special funds to offset some of these costs. For the local effect, also, it's hard to make a reliable estimate given the complexity of the bill, and there's a lot in there that I didn't even touch on. But local personal property tax revenues would decrease potentially significantly given the exemption that is put on as more community solar projects come in online.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jeff. Mike, any questions? No questions for Mike Bonney. Do you have any questions for Les on the bills in Annapolis?
I do not.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Les, for the update. And yes, indeed, a lot going on in Annapolis that I think illustrates the interest both in Annapolis as well as, of course, in St. Mary's County on renewable energy and its implications for the 2030 and beyond. And with that, I was going to move on to the business that we have and wanted to begin with community solar. We've talked about it. I just want to be sure that we're all on the same page on these recommendations. So if you look, I would invite all the task force members to go and look at the recommendations that have been provided by Les. These are updated and reflect our conversations that we had. And so I'm going to propose that I'm going to just read each of them. And then at the end, if there's any concerns as I read them, or if you have any feedback, I'll certainly request that feedback. But most of this, as I've reviewed it, reflects our discussion from the last meeting. And then when we go through this, if we need to, we'll continue to table anything that needs to be tabled. And then we'll vote on the ones that we go through. Okay? So that's how we'll proceed. Allowed zones, we talked about this for community solar, that these would be classified, solar projects be allowed in all zones, and it's classified as a utility minor project. And I think we agreed to that last week. That was my recollection. The application process that community solar projects be treated as permitted use. The setback requirements, the task force recommends that the community solar projects be subject to the existing setback requirements for each applicable zone. So you recall last time, Harry went through different zones with different setback requirements associated with each of those zones, and basically they would apply as a utility minor project to this.
Yeah, no different from any other building proposed in those zones.
That's correct. Okay, so it's consistent with the existing zoning, each of the applicable zones. The screening requirements we did amend and discussed a bit, and I think these were friendly amendments put forth. That task force recommends that Type A buffer requirements be applied to community solar projects with the following modification: the buffer be altered to 20 feet and that additional understory vegetation be substituted for canopy trees where the placement of canopy trees could negatively affect the energy generation capacity of that project. And that, I think, reflects the discussion we had. And of course, feel free to jump in at any point, task force members, if you have a concern. We tabled this requirement, but we did discuss it, and I think this does reflect our discussion, so I'll mention this. A developer of a community solar project on decommissioning, this is the decommissioning on number 6, we discussed this and decided that they should submit a decommissioning plan to the county that describes how the site will be restored to its original state prior to the construction of the community solar project within 1 year after the community solar project ceases operation or is deemed abandoned. This plan should be subject to county approval and associated, and I think the one thing that we sort of suggested here was we waived, I'm not sure, we waived the bond requirement here, and that's not contained in here. Okay? The next is other requirements. Community solar projects should not unreasonably restrict or limit historical or scenic view sheds. The commissioners should also consider whether to require a community solar project to submit to the county an operation and maintenance agreement for stormwater management and vegetation upkeep. The agreement should include a bond or other financial agreement acceptable to the county to ensure proper enforcement. Special permits, and that is that typical as well, Mr. Knight? This other requirements, potentially submitting a bond to upkeep or for stormwater management or vegetation upkeep?
So there's typically a bond required during stormwater management construction to guarantee it's constructed to the approved specifications. Then when it passes inspection, that bond is released. What assures inspection and maintenance is a recorded covenant against the land, if you will. An inspections and maintenance agreement is recorded against the land that gives the county the right to enter upon the land to do stormwater inspections and enforce that maintenance be done should it fail inspection.
And so that would fall under the other financial agreement acceptable to the county under that clause. So thank you.
Yep.
Special permits required. The task force does not believe any additional or special permits beyond those currently necessary for a permitted use project should be required. And 9 and 10, there's no changes there. And we have 11 and 12, so we talked a little bit about potential incentives for brownfield, grayfield, and fill-in, as well as, this was 11 and 12, taxation recommendations where we do have some language here. On potential incentives for brownfield, grayfield, we saw the bill that's been passed that perhaps is at the statewide, and if not an incentive, certain kinds of encouragement to do that. Is there anything else that we want to say here, Mr. Thompson? I know you've have helped us here on this, and we've talked about it, right? I'm not sure that without, we discussed this in the past, how we can do this without a fiscal implication for the county. Any thoughts here with any task force member on any incentives here that could be provided?
I don't have any.
Yeah, so I don't think we have any right now, and I think this should be, unless a task force member makes a proposal, we should strike this. We did have language, Les, didn't we have language that the, prior to this, I think in encouraging the commissioners, that was kind of all, and this goes to number 12, perhaps, the county, this is a little bit more detailed 12, where the county may wish to consider the creation of a payment in lieu of taxes program or other fiscal incentives for community solar located desirable areas. I'm not sure that, let me try to read that again, make sure it's correct. The county may wish to consider the creation of a payment in lieu of taxes, potentially, it says pilot program or other fiscal incentives for community solar projects located, I think, in desirable areas, we need in, or that address the energy needs of economically disadvantaged communities. I think.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I agree that an "in" is needed there where you indicated. What I could do is expand this language out to note that some potential desirable areas could be brownfield, gray fields, or where it serves as infill development.
I think that's consistent. That would be consistent with what I think you're trying to get at, and it also would take care of number 11, since this would be a kind of suggestion, right, an encouragement to the commissioners. Any thoughts by the task force members on number 12 and potentially striking 11, making 12 sort of the main suggestion that we provide on incentives to community, for community solar?
So I guess my comment would be my very limited experience of payment in lieu of taxes is generally people make the payment and not go through the complication of doing all the things we want done. So it kind of gets you off the hook on this, depending on how it's applied and how it's worded. So I am concerned that you would have payment in lieu of taxes if we're trying to accomplish what we set out to do.
Which is a kind of incentive of some sort. You don't see it as a really, you're saying that it's not a real,
not a positive,
particularly good incentive to encourage people. Any other thoughts, Mr. Shaw?
No, I'm fine with the current language.
Bonnie, do you have any thoughts on these encouragement here?
I do not.
Les, I know you wanted to add in something here. Could you want to please go ahead?
So at the end of the first sentence on number 12, I would put the "in" and located in desirable areas, and then I would add a second sentence that would read, the county should consider brownfield, grayfield, and infill development sites as areas where to focus community solar development.
I think that's a good recommendation. Do you have any thoughts on this payment in lieu of taxes? I take it that would be a pilot, the payment in lieu of taxes. Okay. Do you have any thoughts about that, Les, as an encouragement?
So I do know that a number of other counties, for utility scale, and less so for community because community is still very new, have adopted a pilot option. The recommendation here is simply that the county may wish to consider. So I think that is saying, take a look at the financials or other fiscal incentives. So it's not limiting it to a pilot, or it's not even saying that a pilot has to be done. I do know other counties have been satisfied with how they set up and implemented their pilot programs. It may be the task force may wish to reach out to one of those counties. I believe Caroline has done a pilot and has generally been happy with it. There's a few others out there that you could get a little more information.
Yeah, I think we're not ready yet to approve this, so I'll suggest that we table this one more time until we get that information and finish this on the next meeting. And then on 11, I would suggest, at least at this time, that we eliminate this since we don't really have anything else, so that'll be something that we eliminate. So I want to move then that we strike 11, that we table 12, and that we approve recommendations 2 through 8 for community solar.
Second?
Discussion? Okay. Let's take a vote on this now. So all those in favor of accepting recommendations 2 through 8 for the community solar, say aye.
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 All those opposed?
Aye.
Okay. Aye. So everyone was in favor of this. So all these, I think we're just about done then, the community solar, with the exception of number 12, which we've tabled, pending some additional information. Thank you for that. Now, utility scale solar. So we need to go through this. We already had one, the definition. This is the standard definition that's used in the state. It's consistent with what's generally used. 2, I think we developer notification, this was there. The county should urge utility-scale solar project developers to communicate with the county as early as possible. And I think that's certainly something that we've been discussing throughout. I think we also talked about integration of developer concerns and the PJM. Since these are greater than 2 megawatts, these systems, the utility scale, it means that really PJM will have to weigh in on this, right, as well as in the CPCN process. Isn't that correct, Mr. Shaw?
That is correct.
Okay, so I think we do not need to really, we can strike integration of developer concerns less, and I don't think we need that in there any longer.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I have that. And if we could go back to recommendation 2 for just a moment.
Which recommendation?
There had been some discussion about number 2, the developer notification communication requirements, and perhaps, and I'm not sure if this is for Harry or someone else, but potentially recommend or identify a county contact that would be used for the developer.
Thank you. That's a friendly amendment to this. Harry, do you have any suggestions? Should we put in there a point of contact in here?
Yes, by all means, we can put the Department of Land Use Growth Management with the main number.
Okay, let's, so moved, and I think that's a friendly amendment. Les, you heard that?
I mean, do you think it should be more staff-specific, or division of the department?
I don't think, I mean, I think you would know, and I don't think it has to be too specific since people come and go, but
But it's helpful to say Department of Land Use Growth Management as opposed to Public Works and Transportation.
that's correct.
Yeah.
All right, so I think that's a good recommendation. Yep, so we'll put that in there. Please do that, Les. Thank you for reminding us of that, and I had that written down, but I've forgotten it. And so, Les, do you want to talk about number 4, right? We had, where allowed, I think in the commercial, we talked about sort of historic areas, right? Any kind of, other kinds of I think in commercial zones here, we just want to be more specific. Can you talk about this a little bit? We did talk about it less about where this should be allowed. And as you know, we've been concerned about, in particular, historic preservation. We've also were concerned about, in the past, prime farmland. But where to allow now in the zoning?
So I think from the discussions of the task force, you would want to treat this as a utility major use. You treated community solar as a utility minor use, and I think utility scale obviously is at a much greater size. Based on how other counties have done this, most counties allow it in industrial zones. They also allow it in at least some residential agricultural zones. So how St. Mary's categorizes that. And some counties do allow utility scale to be sited in their more heavy or dense commercial zones, but many do not. So I think that's really up to, and Harry can weigh in here on what the appropriate zone classifications would be. You also have the question here, I think, of how you want to treat residential or agricultural areas that have ag preservation easements on them, and if you want to somehow limit or restrict that. We will have a discussion coming up on recommendation 5 of how it's done by right permitted use special exception, and then in recommendation 6 will be any type of individual or aggregate size limit on the project. So those aspects of the discussion are probably wait until we get to those recommendations.
Harry, do you want to say anything here about some of these residential zones? And the other thing that we haven't said is anything is about the location, the base, right? And that location around the base. I don't know if we need to say it here. That 2 mile. We have that circumference around the base on many of the maps that we talked about just the beginning of the task force. So
Yes. And so and of course, we tasked the Chesapeake Conservancy with doing our solar siting report, which actually was just finalized today and distributed to the task force members so that you'll be able to review it and understand it in greater detail and have a presentation by the Chesapeake Conservancy next month, if you so desire. Now, so my concept in trying to identify where utility scale solar is allowed is to make use of that solar siting study. And the map that they created, which has already identified actual parcels based on the, I'm going to call it a selection criteria. One is within a mile of the utility lines. Another is not in a rural legacy area. So, you can name the things that steer you towards the preferred locations and those things that exclude the preferred locations. So if we were to rattle off, what's exclusion zones, the rural legacy areas, the properties that are more than 50% forested, properties that have prime soils. We had the presentation from the resource conservation people. There's two types of soils they talk about. One is, so one would be exclude properties that have more than 50% of a certain classification of a soil, another is more than 75% of another. You mentioned the Navy base. We could propose a specific distance from the Navy base. 2 miles is what the Navy suggested as the closest, but then they also have a 10-mile concern, and they reserve the right to look at anything that is proposed in St. Mary's County. So those are all the exclusion areas. The local St. Mary's County Airport did not ask for any exclusion from building around the local airport. So, you know, the list that's mentioned, residential, agricultural, industrial zones, should we consider commercial? So, you know, is solar a bad neighbor to other commercial users? And would it prevent other commercial development on the vacant parcel next to a solar field? So I don't really see any negativities there. So getting back to the solar siting map, they offered up two classifications of where it should go. Optimal, which is already the built environment, every existing roof, every existing parking lot, every degraded property, every publicly owned property. That's what they call optimal. And you're probably, I mean, you could potentially get some utility scale if it's broken into individual segments that are going to be networked somehow. So then that leaves us the preferred ground-mounted opportunities per the solar siting study. And the preferred ground-mounted, again, are based on being within a mile of the infrastructure, at least 5 acres in size, not in the rural legacy, not 50% forested, not in the critical area, not with the good soils. Does it matter if one of those parcels is residentially zoned? I mean, that's a consideration. Is a solar field a bad neighbor to some houses next door? Or vice versa, if I have a solar field building houses on the vacant parcel next door, is that going to interfere? So I would tend to want to say it's allowed where it is identified as optimal or preferred in our final version of our solar siting map.
Thank you. And the question I think I have in terms of just operations here, if that would be possible to put that in language in this, or we would need to, a couple questions come up, or we would need to sort of list some of the areas where it would not be permitted, and we would need to do that, if only to indicate it to the commissioners that was our recommendation. The other thing you asked about neighbors, since this is since we're considering, right, that this is going to be classified, I don't know if we've gotten to it yet, but as a major, right, as a utility major, that will affect how it interacts with the other adjacent zones, such as residential, and that will be required to put in certain kinds of buffers in that case because it's a utility major. Is that correct?
Well, yes, if we follow the standard zoning pattern that you determine what the compatibility of the uses are, and do you need to provide buffer yards to make one more compatible to the other, or maybe even more palatable to the other. So with the community scale, you arrived at a certain buffer yard that would be required when it's adjacent to certain uses. And so that same table can be used to determine which uses are less compatible and therefore need more of a buffer yard.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps other members need to weigh in here.
Yeah, I've got, when you say half forested, if you have 100 acres and half of it's forested, does that eliminate the whole 100 acres or just the forested portion?
Well, that eliminated that whole, let's say I have 100 acres and it's 55% forested. That eliminated that 100-acre parcel from the listing of a preferred location.
I wonder why, is there a rationale for that? I don't understand.
Well, the rationality was that they had to come up with certain criteria to apply to the geospatial information available, and basically sift out the chaff and arrive at the quality land. And so those were the parameters they set up. Now, it could be adjusted, but we also could have someone say, I know it's not a preferred location per your map, but I would like you to consider that parcel to be allowed just the same.
Yep. Thank you. Bonnie?
Yeah, I was going to pipe that in with what Harry said. They had to go with some sort of a metric to run through. They weren't going to look at each parcel individually.
So let's make sure I know what you're suggesting so that we can definitely put this in and represent your thinking on this. So you're agreeing with Mike's suggestion that potentially in the case of a wooded area of 50%, greater than 50% forested, that be considered despite the fact that it might be not be in the preferred. So that would be one of them that we would call out and say that should also be permitted, so to speak, or allowed for utility scales.
So right, what we're doing here is our ideal perfect situation. I mean, any parcel, right, they can run through the process. What we're trying to do is say, hey, this is best bet sort of situation. Right?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
So the purpose of the map is to identify parcels where the process is going to be easy and minimal objection. Correct?
Yes, I think it was the map was to identify, the exclude areas that were we may not want to consider putting utility scale, and some of that was in preferred agricultural areas with good soils, as well as perhaps, where we have preservation easements, and there were, I think, even some wetlands. There was a lot of different categories there, and so the map was intended to sort of basically show all the areas, and of course the other consideration was within 1 mile of I think a transmission line, and so that was really the idea, is to sort of get all the acreage that really where it could, be reasonable to build utility scale solar.
Yes, where it's easy for yes to occur. But as with anything in this county, right, if you've got a piece of property and you run through the proper processes or permitting or special permits or exemptions or whatever, you can pretty much do what you want until there's an actual authority. Right.
I'm not sure I understand. I'm sorry, Bonnie.
So let's take this parcel, 100 acres, 55% of it forested. Somebody does want to do utility scale on the non-forested side, but it doesn't fall within our yes, go do it solar task force. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't start a process of, hey, I don't think this quite fits. I think that I should be able to do this. Do I need to separate out the property or that, right?
Harry, do you want to weigh in on that, Harry?
Well, yeah, and so I think Mike made a perfect suggestion, and I think Bonnie is agreeing with his suggestion that my initial description of they gave us number 1 optimal and number 2 preferred ground mount opportunities Well, what about that 45 acres that's part of a 100-acre parcel that is already clear? And so if it's not the quality soil, if it's not in the rural legacy, so I think we do need to have this third option. So option one is optimal, option two is preferred ground-mounted opportunity, and the option three is these others. The challenge is how to classify those others, but I think that's a good suggestion.
Yeah, I think I understood Bonnie to be asking that if someone wanted to put up utility scale in something other than optimal or preferred, or perhaps even other than the forested, over 50% forested, could they do so given these suggestions that we're making to the commissioners, assuming the commissioners accepted it?
Yeah, well, that's the key, is what are the suggestions? What are the recommendations? So, my initial discussion to try to help you arrive at your recommendation is, rather than look at the zones that we have in the zoning ordinance, is now let's look at the solar siting map that we've, engaged the Chesapeake Conservancy to provide. Their solar siting map, if we take their parameters and their recommendation, it would be the optimal or the preferred ground mounted. But that would leave out some parcels that might still be acceptable, depending on what the recommendations are.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And we've identified one. Is there anything else that any task force members want to mention?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I do have slight concerns with that. If we're referencing the solar siting map into some level of zoning ordinance, that now opens the entire study to public opinion, public input. I think we need to open it, because when everything went through zoning, it was open for public input. So if we're going to use this to give final determination like this, I think we're going to have to open that up to scrutiny and input as well, if we stick away from what we know today as all the zones within the current zoning law.
Thank you.
That's,
I'm
well, that was exactly why we had the commissioners approve the temporary moratorium, is because we are going to open up the zoning ordinance. These recommendations that the Solar Task Force arrives at in June will then be taken and turned into proposed zoning text amendments for the ordinance, and they will have to go through the public hearing process. Before we, and I'm sorry, Bonnie, I cut you off, but just one more thing about the map. Our director's recommendation is that the solar siting map not become part of our adopted zoning maps. So we want to reference, and so this will be another legal challenge, we want to reference the St. Mary's County solar siting map. We now own it. We can tweak it different from the map that, I mean, the Chesapeake Conservancy built it for us. But we now own it, and we can massage it into our final version. And in the regulations, the concept is we would reference the St. Mary's County solar siting map, but not make that map part of the official zoning maps, because then any massaging we think we need to do in the future would have to go through the total zoning map adoption process.
That's what I was getting to.
Yeah.
So it does sound like we will need to really also provide additional granularity on what is being excluded in this discussion here. And it will have to be put sort of not just simply refer to the map, but rather talk about a lot of the zones, right, or a lot of the areas that could potentially be right in the exclusion zone, so to speak, or in the exclusion areas. So I do think we might need to go through that and make sure that all the task force members understand what's being excluded. Obviously, we haven't gone through this report yet, so we still have time to do that. But it may be worthwhile, Les, for us to work through that to sort of try to characterize some of the things that are being excluded for certain and some of the criteria that they used so that we can put this into use language that everyone can understand, the task force members, but also the commissioners, about what's being included and what is being recommended to be excluded.
So, got a comment?
Yeah.
The circumferential delineation or whatever around the Navy base, I would think we would want to leave that open to the recommendation of the Navy as opposed to some strict limit, because 2 years from now, they may be saying, we want solar with it, so let them have that play rather than us incorporating something that they've said right now that may change tomorrow.
I feel perfectly, I think that's a reasonable suggestion. They did suggest, right, what they want it now, so that I'm not sure, maybe we could put that in some ways that current or put in what they suggested now. Would we be able to put in some language that allows them to amend that? Or would that have to be, Mr. Knight, could it be that could not be kind of a variable in there that they would be allowed to change? Or could that be something that we could put language in that would allow the Navy to change their view on where solar could go with respect to the base and change their mind, basically?
Well, certainly, when it comes to arriving at our version of the recommended solar siting map for St. Mary's County, if the Navy wanted to provide input that they think the line needs to move, we would be able to move the line. The question is whether or not that is an officially adopted map through the zoning map process, which we recommend it not be, so that we can make those adjustments without going to public hearing. Truth is, if the Navy wants to, flex their muscles on anything, they can certainly make it difficult for local government to give an approval, because they are so important to us.
All right.
And the last thing we want to do is ruffle their feathers or not provide what
Yes,
they need.
indeed.
But so, they were a bit, I'll be honest, I felt like they were a little bit non-committal. They mentioned the 2 miles, they mentioned the 10 miles, but they really didn't want to offer us a map to incorporate with a line. So is it 2 miles from the runway? Is it 2 miles from the property line? I'd have to go back but by all means, we have a very open dialogue with their local planning liaison, Sabrina Hecht, and we will continue that. Vanessa Price is with her staff. Sabrina just left on deployment and will be back, but Vanessa is communicating with us in the meantime.
Yeah, Bonnie.
Hey, can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
So they didn't give us a map because all it is a diet. They just did a buffer from the center point of each installation, which is why when you look at Webster, so much more public property is incorporated versus what you see with Pax River. It's a generic response to a requirement that wasn't in place until a few years ago. So the Navy wouldn't have the middle for that. And again, Harry brought up the good point. The Navy is going to do what the Navy wants to do to stop anything once it's at a particular process, depending on the flavor of the administration. The other thing, though, that I did want to bring up with this is that, and maybe this is, I'm coming at this from a different mindset, there are already legal tools in place to exclude and preserve land, conservation easements and agriculture easements. So if somebody wants to exclude their property from development, they already have the tools in place to do that. So in my mind, what we were doing with this map was we were identifying optimal locations, not excluding locations and excluding people from using their public property as they see fit.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true, and trying to give recommendations. We're still then, I think we'll be in the position of having to say, however, where this is going to be permitted or where this is allowed. So, I think.
It's still, yeah, it's still zoning recommendations. Okay.
What's that?
Yeah, it's still zoning recommendations of what permissible use is. And we already have processes in place that, if you want exemptions or whatever.
Yeah, and I think Bonnie makes a very good point. Moving forward, it's much more appropriate and positive to say we're identifying preferred locations and and not use the word exclusion zone.
Yeah.
So here's the preferred, those are the not preferred.
Right, and then also to emphasize what's already being excluded, so to speak, by law, right? Where people are, development would not be permitted.
Where people already have easements or agriculture easements or, critical area buffer.
Right. So as much as we don't, as much as we don't want to use the word exclusion, the comprehensive plan, which is already adopted by St. Mary's County government through the public hearing and community involvement process, includes key elements about the preservation of the rural character, farmland, so on. Those are our Mattaponi and Hunter Creek, I believe it's called, rural legacy areas. So while I wouldn't, while I won't call them the exclusion zone, they have been mapped as not preferred locations. So when we move forward saying here's an allowable zone, it's not going to be in the rural legacy area.
Right. I do think we need additional language here, Les, that goes through some of these categories a little bit and incorporates in I think the recommendations by Mike and Bonnie, and that we try to at least capture some of the areas that we, where it's clear by law that Bonnie suggested they're really not permitted, right? But then to somehow capture the areas where we want to be able to allow this and make it kind of a little bit clearer to the commissioners.
So I can definitely take a shot at, based on all of the task members' input, and connect with Mr. Knight before next meeting to come up with some broad outline language that will encapsulate that, focusing on preferred areas as opposed to exclusion areas, but still know, where law basically says you can't go now. I would also say one other potential area that I'm not sure has been touched on by the task force, and you may or may not want to consider it separately, but that would be the issue of, do you want utility scale solar to go in your growth areas, whether it's your priority funding areas or other county or municipality identified growth areas. And I think given the scope and potential size of utility scale solar, and especially on residential properties, if you have a municipality that's outlined with future growth areas and its annexation plan, the county has worked with them to approve that, and then suddenly a utility scale solar project is set to be placed right in the middle of that future growth zone, that could potentially be very disruptive to the planned growth of that site. So that may be something you want to consider. Other counties and municipalities have actually had a couple of instances where that's happened. They've had to work around it, and that was prior to having any type of formal identified zoning for them.
I agree with you that we should consider that, and maybe we should have that in there a little bit and have a discussion about that next time, unless people have a thinking about it right now about how we should deal with this.
I'm good with including it.
Okay. Okay. So let's include that, a discussion of that as well, Les.
And Chairman, would you want me to share any of those zone tables? or-
Absolutely. I actually reviewed them before. I think it is going to be very helpful to have that, to walk through this kind of carefully so that we can both explain it to the commissioners and also to ourselves that what we are recommending and what we're not recommending.
Yeah, but what I meant is, like, right now, this evening, do you want to look at those use tables like
Sure.
we did with community minor?
Sure, to remind us.
Let me see. Because we've talked about the solar siting map, but now to actually get to the other zones.
The zoning classifications.
Yeah. So here was utility major, use intensity high, as opposed to utility minor. And while Les has incorporated this, I was under the impression we might actually create two new use types. One would be solar minor and solar major, just to separate them out from these other utilities. Because these other utilities wouldn't have that special buffer yard.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So we'll need to do that, you're saying, in order
From this point forward, rather than call them utility major and utility minor, call them solar major and solar minor.
Okay, that's a good point.
So if we compare a proposed solar major to a current utility major, it's a high use intensity, which is going to affect the buffer yard table. It's a conditional use in the rural preservation zone.
Would you remind me what that means again?
Yeah, so conditional use means it would go to the Board of Appeals for a public hearing to see if there are any special conditions they think need to be placed upon the project.
Okay.
Other conditional uses are mining operations, major industrial operations in the rural zone. So anyway, it would not be a permitted use in the RSC and RCL. These are rural service center and rural commercial limited. These are at our small village centers and crossroads. They're already occupied by existing minor commercial uses. The RLT is a transitional low-density residential zone between the rural preservation district and the residential low density. So there can be large tracts of undeveloped land in those zones. So while they're intended for low-density residential, maybe they would be well used for solar and would not be incompatible to the houses next door. But again, they would be conditional uses, so the houses next door would be invited to the public hearing to weigh in. You can see then it's not allowed in these other zones, but again, that's utility major. And so these other zones are residential medium density, where we're trying to crowd houses in more tightly packed in the development district, in the Lexington Park Development District. Residential high density, residential neighborhood conservation. These are our existing subdivisions of over 25 lots that have a certain character. The residential mixed-use zone, so this is going to be residential and commercial mixed uses, village mixed use, town center mixed use. So villages are like Callaway, town centers are Charlotte Hall. Corridor mixed use, these are along the highways. California and Great Mills Road have areas of corridor mixed use. Mixed use high density residential, mixed use medium density residential, mixed use low density residential. LCI is honestly a new one whose name escapes me, but I think it's like a low commercial industrial type, and then we have the industrial zone. So I don't know that, do you necessarily want to exclude utility scale solar from those other zones? Once again, if we went to the solar siting map,
Right. I mean, that's the key here. I mean, so here we have these categories,
Yeah.
but we don't know how the Chesapeake Bay Conservancy map corresponds to each of these zones, right?
well, if it's built on, it's optimal because their
Yes,
solar siting
yes.
map wants you to put
yeah.
solar on every single
Yeah, but
rooftop,
that's
every
not.
single parking lot.
Yeah, agreed, but that's not utility scale.
We
It's,
expect utility scale, unfortunately, to come forward wanting to use vacant land.
Yeah, right. So I think, from my point of view, to understand how the map works, I'll have to know, for example, especially some of the last ones that you talked about, the mixed use of where there was just a few different houses on, that maybe that falls into the permissible permissible for the Chesapeake Bay Conservancy. So it seems to me we have to think about this a little bit, or at least see how this table maps onto the Chesapeake Bay Conservancy map.
Solar siting map.
Yeah.
Okay? So,
I mean, that's just my opinion as one member of the task force, for me to understand this, because I think you're right. What this is saying, solar major, would exclude most areas, which some of them are obvious, right? We don't want to put them in downtown Leonardtown or downtown Callaway or whatever. But adjacent to that, we may want to allow that, and at least with conditional use. And so I think, I'm not sure how the map that the Chesapeake Bay Conservancy provided corresponds to some of these categories. Any thoughts on that from the other task force members?
Did we see a shapefile or database or something with this report?
I didn't hear the beginning.
I'm sorry, could you repeat yourself, Bonnie?
Did we receive data to put on our actual GIS with this report?
We did receive a map. I don't know what the degree of data that we have provided. They have a very detailed map. Is there any way, maybe to follow up with you, Harry, would there be any way to sort of to put these two together, or is that a sort of very heavy lift for?
Oh, no. And so I think that's exactly what we need to do next month is really focus on the map. And so, I can open those maps while we're here today. But so we can see that this table is geared towards non-solar projects. And so I think right now we've seen enough of this table. We know we need to figure out, do we want to put these Cs? The only other thing you could say here is the task force comfortable that it should always be a conditional use?
I think for each of these categories, I think let's do that as a first cut here.
Okay.
For utility scale, and then if we feel like that's not necessary, then I think certainly we will we'll listen to folks.
All right.
Les, do you have any thoughts on this?
So I think I don't have too much additional offer here. Many counties use conditional use with special exception as a default. There are a few counties that go a little more granular and say in some specific zone areas it's a permitted use, and then in others it could be a conditional use or a special exception. But most would say across the board it's either conditional use or a special exception.
So that is on the next page, 7, item 5, how to apply by right, permitted use, special exception, conditional use.
So just to be clear, so for number 4, we need to go through the zones.
Yeah.
We'll perhaps even make a table that's solar major, solar minor. And it's really just, obviously, solar major is just going to be utility scale. and we'll be able to get a better feel for how the map sort of, how it corresponds to the categories that we have set up, that you have set up on the
Right.
zoning area.
Because solar minor, you've already decided, is a permitted use in all zones.
That's correct.
Right.
That's correct.
And, okay, so that's the consideration. So, I mean, I can move on to the buffer yard chart, or would you rather I bring up a map?
I think that maybe it's up to the committee members, but I think the map, however, I think we need to actually study it. I think that'll take too long. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can probably decide on the buffer yard issue.
Yes.
And then we can start looking at the map and
Yeah, I would like to get through some of these,
Yeah.
Harry, I agree. So what we can get through. And so let's do, I know we have the buffer yard, that's the setback requirements, correct?
Right. So, well, and I don't mean to leave Les's, so like so we know we have to look at the maps to arrive at the answer on number 4,
That's
where
correct.
allowed.
That's
okay?
correct.
So then if we go to 5, how to apply by right, permitted use, special exception, conditional use. And we're not ready to make that decision.
I don't think we are. Les, do you want to say a few words about that? I mean, I don't want to make it difficult. I mean, I don't want to make it overly difficult, right? We have conditional use already that we're talking about, or conditional use with special exemption. Do you have any recommendations here from other counties that can give us a little bit of guidance on this, Les?
So as I previously noted, I think some counties just say in the allowed zone classification for utility scale, they either say it's always by conditional use or it's always by special exception. There's only a couple of counties here, and you can look over in the examples, where they sort of say, well, it's a permitted use in a couple of areas, and it's a conditional use of special exception in others. I think looking at how St. Mary's does its zoning, I would recommend, if you're comfortable, just to say for the allowed areas, it's a conditional use, knowing that we're going to go back to recommendation 4 and be much more specific about which of the zoning areas it's allowed in.
I think that's a reasonable way to proceed. Yep. Any thoughts from other task force members?
I'm good with that.
Yeah, I think that's what we should do. I recommend we do that and put that language in. Les?
Okay.
Yes, yes.
Well, so number 6?
Number 6, yeah, I mean, I think, I am very, very hesitant to put limits on this myself, since, the only thing, there's a suggestion here, and this is, I guess, is that we consider using, the limits being based on current grid capacity. I don't know what implication that has, Mr. Shaw, if any.
Depending on where they're wanting to cite this, it could or could not be a limiting factor. But even if it is limited by grid capacity, there are ways around that by upgrading the grid, if the developer wants to pay that kind of money. So it's...
Any other thoughts from task force members on this?
I don't think we should limit the size if they're meeting the other requirements of setback and buffer that we put in place.
Yeah, I'm worried that if we were to go too far here, that we would not only run into problems with some of what we last brought up many months ago about the perennial decision and having requirements much more stringent than the CPCN process. So I'm reluctant really to put in any kind of aggregate limits or individual size limits. I think in some ways, right, we could still consider grid capacity. Would that have an effect on the developers? So the developers nonetheless would still have to, that would be a cost to the developers, Mr. Shaw, if they were to put in, say, a 50-megawatt system in a place where, the grid needed to be upgraded, they would have to pay for that upgrade, correct?
They do, and they know that well in advance when they go through the PJM study. That's part of the feasibility analysis that we put before them when they come in to PJM with the application. We'll let them know if it's constrained, and if it is, here's what it costs to fix it.
And so even if we did put in language on aggregate limit, the limit of solar is based on, the current grid capacity, that would be, so to speak, a very soft requirement in a sense, because it could be, I think, gotten around or by simply upgrading the grid by the developer. Is that your understanding?
It would be.
I'm not sure the value of putting it in. I wanted to hear, though, from other task force members that they feel like this language should go in there and that there should be. Bonnie's already said there should be no aggregate limits on these projects or individual size limits other than what we're stating in the elsewhere in these recommendations. Anyone else? You want to amend that, Bonnie?
No, I don't want to amend. I just want to kind of expand because, right, we're talking about utility scale. So they're going to fall under the limits that are set at the state PSC, the actual infrastructure itself. So there's enough other factors that could potentially play in how big a utility scale system is. I don't think that we need to put in place anything that's an additional limiting factor, especially since it's kind of handled at the state level.
I agree with you, and I think that's an important factor here that's we should consider. Anyone? I think we all. I'm seeing some nods around. So, Les, I don't think we want to put any limits on this here, knowing full well that, as Bonnie so nicely said, that the CPCN process, and as Mr. Shaw's indicated, there's a number of safeguards here that really will, that have to be met prior to this. And then there's, of course, all the other considerations that we are putting into these recommendations as well. All right. Number 7, the setback requirements. We have in here, Harry, and always, again, relying on some of your expertise here, we're creating these 2 new rows, solar major and solar minor. And for solar minor, we've already actually amended the setback requirements. For solar major, that is utility scale solar, we have not really said much about it. We certainly would want to incorporate, I think, some of the considerations that we already said, at least for, perhaps in industrial. I'm not sure. We might be able to use other areas. Could you help us here?
Well, and just for clarification, so the setback is how close to the property line. This isn't buffer yards yet.
Yep.
And so with all the other solar uses we've been through, up to and including community, also known as minor solar, the existing setbacks per the zoning ordinance in that zone prevail. We did not come up with any special setbacks to apply to solar. And so the way Les has it drafted here, that would be the same for utility scale as well.
Yep. I think that's acceptable. Go ahead, Bonnie.
I was going to say, yeah, I would based on the setback requirements, the screening requirements that we worked through with community solar, I would say just apply it to utility. Because at the edges, right, everything's going to be the same. And it's not like you're getting more pollution.
Yeah, and I think...
Yeah, I would compare it, the setbacks would say you could have a 4-story building that close to the property line, and these ground-mounted solar are not going to be as intrusive as a 4-story building.
Yeah.
Okay, 8, screening. I'm going to bring up that slide. So the high intensity is at the bottom. And so if this was a high intensity major, which is a different animal than a major solar, you can see there are additional buffer yards that were not required for the low intensity.
Right. So we could, for our purposes here, the transportation, community, and utility high, we would be substituting solar high in here potentially. And would you remind us of the ABC buffer yard standards again?
Yeah, and also just so in case this is what Bonnie meant, so like the utility major is high intensity, but that doesn't mean solar major is high intensity. And so if it's also low intensity, then would the minor solar buffer yards be adequate?
Appropriate,
right. But I will show you again what those buffer yards are. Yeah, so this was the A buffer yard, the B buffer yard, and the C.
Yeah, because the buffer impact of solar is going to be the same as utility solar.
So if I heard her correctly, apply the same buffer yard standards to major solar that were applied to minor solar.
Let's do that, and let's make sure that we have these sort of mapped out nicely too, because we're going to need to be able to see these and make sure that we can confirm that. I'm good with that as well, Bonnie. So I think, so that we wouldn't be having additional ones. I just want to see this all laid out to see if there's any. Let's just look at this a second. So for residential, it's B, and it's standard B in low, and that's 65, and type B buffer, canopy trees, underlying trees, and then we made the adjustment that the trees should not in any way diminish the production of the solar equipment.
Yeah, we recommended that the buffer width be altered to 20 feet, and additional understory vegetation could be substituted for canopy trees, where the placement of canopy trees would negatively affect the energy generation capacity of the project. So basically, type A buffer requirements for a few months.
Right. And so, and then C, could I see C one more time? So that's a little bit,
That has a fence.
that had a fence, and this probably will have a fence, but was this a fence that would,
This is intended to be an opaque fence that would block
opaque.
headlights and the like, whereas we expect it to simply have a chain link security fence. So getting back to this one, so the task force recommended on community solar and approved that type A buffer requirements be applied to community solar projects, and I believe the intent was regardless of the adjacent use. So you would disregard the B that you see on this table, that those Bs would be replaced by this modified A.
yeah.
And the modification is that it's 20 foot. So it's the vegetation of the A, but it's been increased by 5 feet.
Yeah, I mean, the only concern I have, and this is my concern, I'm not sure it's shared by the other task force members, is in residential, having a utility scale next to a residential area. Is that so? If that's possible, then for me, I think I'm not positive that can happen and would happen, but if it did, I certainly would want some kind of buffer for the residential area.
It's very possible for two reasons. Number one, there's always the property in a particular zoning district, which is the boundary and so in this example, this is the last property in the residential zoning district, and it borders a different district. And so that different district is where there's going to be some different use, likely. Then our other most common residential is our rural residential. You know, everyone out in the rural zone, every occupied property has someone living on it. And sometimes they're in the center of the property, and sometimes they're close to each other. And so, yeah, it could happen anywhere that you could have the utility scale next to a house.
I mean, I think this does require other members to suggest it. I mean, I personally would prefer something more than just, for residential, something a little bit stricter than what was proposed for commercial, for, I think it was community solar.
So, Chairman.
It doesn't sound like anyone's, it's pretty quiet in here.
I'm
Bonnie?
contemplating.
Yeah.
Looking
Good.
at the different pictures, that's type A.
Yeah, you want to
there.
show us the pictures?
Yeah, and I was about to say, Chairman, maybe to help move that, so do you think it needs more width, more vegetation, or an opaque fence?
I think more vegetation, to be honest, would be sufficient.
Would you be good with C, that's before us, minus the fence?
I would.
But
Get behind that.
keep it at the 20-foot, or keep it where the C is 30-foot?
I'm okay with keeping it at the 30.
Yeah.
That's 10 yard.
When you're looking at that amount of vegetation, if you begin to squeeze that down to 10
Right.
foot less,
Right.
the vegetation will die out because it'll grow upon,
Yeah.
compete with everything else.
And the other consideration with the community is the communities are going to be smaller solar fields. So we didn't want to take from the perimeter and take away usable solar area. But now we're talking about these grander solar fields where taking a little bit around the edge isn't going to diminish the mass as much.
I could get behind a modified C without a fencing requirement.
So, Bonnie, do you have any thoughts on this?
I guess in my mind, and right, I have the risk of having a massive amount of solar behind me. I guess in my mind, a couple rows of solar versus 10 rows of solar doesn't really make that big of a difference. You're not getting noise, you're not getting smell, and we're trying to maximize this property. So unless it helps with like stormwater or something, I don't really see the necessity for that setback to be different than what we have for community. Personally.
Yeah. So I think I feel comfortable with C and without the opaque fencing. And I think that would, obviously, that would just be limited to where the residency is, right? The property line, or would that have to go around the entire?
No, only where it's adjacent to that other use.
That's right.
Yeah,
So
the less compatible use.
I think I am comfortable with this, and I think that seems to me something that's appropriate to protect residents from large utility scale solar, and still allows them to in some ways shield or what these buffers do is to not have to see this directly from their backyard, so to speak. And it may or may not happen, but I don't think it will put undue pressure on the developer, since this would be probably, this wouldn't be in a strictly residential neighborhood, so to speak, right, for utility scale, but would be in a more rural area, and it would be only in the case of perhaps a property that's, where the house is somewhere adjacent, it'd be an issue.
So also substitute the understory for canopy trees?
Yes, I think that's right.
Now, you were focused on the residential. Do you think you need a buffer next to agricultural on the far left?
I don't personally.
Okay. And so then if we move to the right, public, semi-public, commercial, industrial.
And there we had in the other case, right, where I would say that we do the modified, what we had for community solar.
Let me ask the question.
Yeah,
and
yes,
this
please.
is directed to Harry. We're setting the different buffer yard as the zoning exists today, and it's an agricultural setting. They go through a zoning modification, it becomes residential. Do we then force them to go back and plant more, or?
No, so the buffer yard, and again, the buffer yard that we're talking about here is the proposed use is the major solar, and the adjacent use is a use, not a zone. There's an actual use occurring on the property. Now, I buy a vacant property next to a major solar, and I build a house next to a major solar. That major solar doesn't have to do anything because it was there first. This is how the new use coming in does something to accommodate the existing use next door.
But by the same token, if I put in a 10-story somehow apartment unit, I'm allowed to do that even though it shades the solar.
Until Maryland passes a law that, we have no laws that protect view sheds or protect you from shade. Yeah, such laws do exist in the nation, but not here.
So this is, I would encourage, we still have to vote on this, Bonnie, so there's nothing been decided.
Yeah, no, I'm fine with it. With adjacent residential, 30 foot, no fence, yeah. For utility scale, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. I think we then have the screening requirements. Les, did you get that?
I got that.
Okay, thank you.
Right, so I'll get rid of that slide.
The decommissioning requirements is number 9. The task force recommends that utility scale solar developer provide proof to the county as it complied with decommissioning requirements, including proof of bond, other financial security set forth by the PSC. So yes, of course, we're basically recommending what's consistent with the PSC requirements for utility scale solar. No amendment to that. Other requirements, number 10, utility scale projects should not unreasonably restrict or limit historical or scenic view shed. This was the same language, Les, that we used in some of the other types of solar, correct? And so the commissioners should also consider whether a utility scale project to submit to the county an operation and maintenance agreement for stormwater management and vegetation upkeep. The agreement should include a bond or other financial agreement acceptable to the county. I think that I'm good with the should not unreasonably restrict historical or scenic view shed. I hope any thoughts by the other task force members? I think we're all in agreement, less on that, as well as the bond or other financial agreement that was explained to us earlier by Harry. I think that language looks acceptable to me. Is that clear, Les?
Yes, it is.
And that,
Mike?
on the bond, it's very, very feasible that the county would not require a bond.
That's right, and that's what Harry suggested, and there could be things in lieu of that that would be acceptable to the county and to the developer, hopefully. 11, special permits require, I don't think we certainly don't think there should be additional permits here beyond what should be, will be required, since I think we have plenty of requirements that we've sort of been going through, right? Okay. The military concerns, the task force, basically you're reminding us here that we haven't made any recommendations here. regarding the use of commercial, in this case, industrial or institutional solar accessory with respect to the military. So I think I do think we need to think about this, right? And we talked about it. Harry?
Yeah, well, I liked the word you just said, that they're in respect to the military, so some sort of language about respecting the appropriate setbacks from the important military installations, Pax River and Webster Field.
Bonnie?
So if we incorporate, if we incorporate the data layer that's already at the Maryland state level, like if we incorporate that into our permanent GIS, hey, for any solar projects, you may or may not have to go through this process based on this data or this zone, sort of like the ACUS, right? Like the ACUS doesn't eliminate all development, but it's just hey, by the way, this is where the ACUS is, and this may or may not impact your project. So we could do the same thing with the solar data layer.
Yeah, so there's the Smart DG state website that actually already maps the military installations.
So the suggestion here, Bonnie, by you is to maybe recommend that to the developer, the county commissioners here, that they use that as their indicator for whether or not, to put this military concern in?
You could either reference the Smart DG site of the process to get your solar development approved. We could just send them there. Okay, you may have to go through this process if your property falls within that site. Or conversely, we could just get the data layer and add it to our county GIS and say, hey, you may have to deal with these people if you want to develop here.
Right, and your remark too is not necessarily to the military, but the broader issue of anything, so to speak, of any development should go through the Smart DG site with utility scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's two different paths we could go. We could just say, hey, reference this, or we could provide the data layer itself within our own county GIS.
Les, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think having them check, at least going through that exercise, is reasonable for any reason. In terms of specifically, to the extent the county might be able to incorporate the data layers into its own GIS, just in case for some reason, and I don't see this happening, but just in case for some reason the Smart DG program and map suddenly go away for funding issues or other things at the state level, you've got it locally, so you can still require that. If something were to happen and the Smart DG program were to change substantially at the state level, that could put you in a situation that you might not want to use it.
I think your suggestion, Bonnie, is a good one generally. So, and I hear what you're saying, Les, about putting this in if the Smart DG site goes away somehow, right? We have some of this information in there. I still personally think that the commissioners would welcome any remarks about the military. So I think to the degree that we can cite some things here, Les, about, that we are really trying to respect the concerns that the military have here, and that we, perhaps, I'm not sure, Harry, but could this be part of any conditional use that they have to consult with the military? If so, impact?
Well, the Navy is already on our technical evaluation committee, so any project is going to be shared with the Navy. But yeah, I can tell you, having been through both the public hearing on the moratorium and then the decision, the one thing that is brought up is the Navy, and Commissioner Morgan, who initiated this solar task force, was concerned about protecting the Navy. Commissioner O'Connor at the public hearing specifically pointed out that the Navy means 22,000 jobs to St. Mary's County. So I think a strong recommendation of respecting the Navy, understanding the need to protect the Navy's mission, those usual types of statements is what the commissioners would like to see.
Okay, so Les, I'll work with you to provide some language there so that the task force can see this. And of course, any task force members that has language that they want to recommend, I invite them to provide that to Les. Number 13, the county should support policy changes at the state level to allow an affected county or municipality to have an automatic right to participate in the PSC hearing process as a party of interest is desired. You saying this is not less required currently?
Currently, no, this is not required. This is something that I think the PSC itself is interested in. Right now, a county or municipality has to file a petition to become a party of interest. Usually those are granted, but it is an extra administrative and legal step. Here, it would basically flip it and say, you're automatically considered in if you want to be. You don't have to file that separate petition to be found as a party of interest.
Yeah, I would think that the county should be involved in this, but I don't know if other task force members believe that. I'll yield the floor to hear any other thoughts on this. So this does seem like the right place for this, Les, since it really is utility scale and involves the PSC. So I do think that the county should be allowed to sort of have an automatic right to participate. This would not obviously be a zoning change, but rather just a recommendation to the commissioners. Any thoughts from any other task force members?
No arguments.
I agree with you.
Okay, I think we all agree on that, Les, that should be put in and provided. Since I think the task force was I think the commissioners as well as many people in St. Mary's County believe that we should have some say into utility scale development in the county. Here we have potential incentives for brownfield or grayfield development. Again, I think we probably should, I'm not sure if we had other language there. Does anyone have any suggestions here on that?
Mr. Chairman, if I could offer a suggestion, I could do the same thing for the utility scale that you adopted for the community solar and bring down, mention brownfield, grayfield development down in recommendation 15 under the pilot.
Yeah, I would be good with that. This does not constrain the developers. It just is, and it doesn't constrain the commissioners, but it does give the commissioners a sense, as well as the developers, of where we would prefer development, but that doesn't require development in those areas. Yeah, so I think without objection then, we will put that language in to number 15.
14?
We're going to, yeah, exactly. Thank you. And 15, just like before, 14 and 15 will be, Sandy, we're going to strike really one of them, and they'll be combined.
Okay. Got it.
Les, I think is that all on utility scale? That's all I have on the recommendations so far. Do any other task force members wish to add anything that we didn't cover? We could still go back. I do want to characterize some of the things we need to do next time.
Nothing further to add.
Okay, Bonnie, are you good?
No, yeah, I'm good. I'm looking forward to dig it into the map data.
Okay, so we still have some work to do here on utility scale to go through this, especially on number 4. And then I think we're going to have to work through that a little bit more, Mr. Knight and Les. And we're going to certainly need some of your help and guidance on that so that we can get a better feel for both the language we should put in here, but more importantly, the main ideas that we have to bring forward to the commissioners. And so with that, I think, Les, do you have any further questions for us?
Not at the moment. I will follow up with Harry prior to next meeting to work through the language, particularly number 4, and to make sure all the terminology is right in a couple of the other adopted recommendations.
Okay, thank you very much, Les. Harry, do you have any final thoughts before we adjourn?
No, sir.
Okay.
I noticed, so Bonnie says she's getting in and she's raising her hand.
Thank you, Bonnie. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, I just had one real quick request of Perry. The zoning definitions, or what the zoning stands for. Do we have is there a handy document or link or something for that?
There is, you're familiar with the St. Mary's County zoning, where the St. Mary's County website?
Yeah. Got it.
And so if you go to public agencies and then choose land use and growth management.
Why is this not in? Oh, it is in. Oh, interesting. Okay, that's a way to do it. Okay.
And then in the lower right-hand corner, it should be ordinances.
AE ordinances. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, so you see ordinances, and then it should be the one for the Lexington Park Development District.
And that will have.
That's the new list of zones that were created in the Lexington Park Development District. So that is the best source for the full list of zones.
Got it. Okay.
Not only what their titles are, but what their purposes are.
Okay. Yeah, that'll be research at a time. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you very much for that question. And I think, yeah, we still have some work to do. My optimism of finishing today, Les, I'm going to continue to be optimistic. I know we're not finished, but we made some progress, and I think we clarified some of the things we need to do still. So we'll do that for next time, and we will then go through and hopefully get through the utility scale recommendations and be able to clarify that. I'll be in touch with you, Les, as needed. And with that, I move to adjourn this meeting.
Second.
All in favor?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Jeff, for your assistance on this. And of course, Les and Harry, thank you, Sandy. If you have any questions about the minutes, please let me know. Thank you very much.